Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and just a handful of days ago, Season 2 officially kicked off for the War Within expansion. And the first few weeks of a season are usually pretty volatile as they continue to adjust and tune our classes to create some sort of semblance of balance for the new season in terms of endgame content, to make sure that PvP competition is a little bit more spread out and not one-sided, but also to make sure that certain new dungeons and raids and mechanics are not overly punishing. And that's exactly what they're trying to do this week in particular. A lot of the Mythic Plus dungeons this week are gotten nerfed by quite a bit, which should hopefully make the Pugging experience as of Season 2 much better than when the season launched. And already over the past PTR, they try to make these dungeons as easy as possible. It was already looking fairly positive, but with this set of changes, this definitely helps out the Pugging experience of the season. Regarding PvP, they also decided to do a bunch of adjustments for a handful of classes already seen the meta solidify in a very specific way that tried to pull back on some of the more popular options, adjust a handful of playstyles to make sure that they don't scale out of control. And I want to go over the PvE dungeon changes, but also the PvP class changes in today's video. The dungeon changes are actually already live and have been hotfixed into the game and are active currently, while PvP changes are set to release on the next week's reset. As always, if you guys want to see more regular updates for 11.1, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right into this list. So first things first, I want to first of all go over all of the dungeon changes that impact PvE content, and then we'll go over all of the new class changes that are arriving very soon in a handful of days for the PvP players currently playing out in the ladder. So when it comes to dungeon changes, there's a big variety of them, a lot of different dungeons affected, and for the most part, a lot of these are going to constitute nerfs to these dungeons. They're not making dungeons harder, in fact, they're actually making it easier for players, especially if you're pugging. One of the core focuses here is to nerf these dungeons for Mythic 0 content, which is for entry-level players to get some champion track gear, explore those dungeons, and get into the whole system of Mythic Plus content after you get yourself geared up a little, but also to nerf the experience and make it easier for players progressing through the Mythic Plus systems. Broadly, every single dungeon and all the enemies inside of it are seeing a 10% enemy health reduction and a damage reduction, which is a sizable nerf. This means that the gear gap in terms of trying to get into some of the more higher end dungeons is a little bit easier. This means the pug experience is going to be improving. And then they also wanted to fix some of the pain points with every one of these instances. Like dungeons such as Floodgate, Swamp Phase boss, his main big ability, the AoE damage of Awakened Swamp and the Rushing Tide, that has been nerfed a little bit. Damage has been lowered in order to make it a little bit easier for healers and the group to survive. Demolition Duo, especially with the bomb clearing mechanic, that has been made a little bit easier, and they also reduced a decent bit of damage within the entire instance. Cinderbream Meteorite, they took the first boss, the intermission during Eldryer boss, made that a little bit easier on healers, and have reduced some of the IPA's mechanics and the adds to make that encounter just a little bit more bearable. In the Dark Flame Cleft, they mostly ended up nerfing the first boss, which is Waxbeard, reducing melee damage by that boss, which is going to make it a little bit easier for the tank in particular to have a little bit easier time surviving. In the dungeon of Motherlode, they had some few pain points like the crawler mines for the tail end of the dungeon got nerfed, but also the off-duty laborers at the very beginning of the dungeon can now be pulled into other packs that made it a lot easier, as they're yellow mobs, not even elite mobs, but they were kind of terrifying if you pulled too many of them. And the Azurite extractors after the first boss are going to make it a little bit easier for groups that are pugging to have less of a chance of just falling apart with that damage greatly reduced. In the dungeon of Macagon, they made a couple of adjustments. There, specifically anti-personnel squirrels after Cujo fight, those can now be taken out by melee players, which makes it much easier to position yourself and take out those threats instead of having to back away from it as a mechanic, because there are some narrow hallways in that instance. Plus, also, third boss Fireline's visuals have been improved, and then there's the dungeon of Priory, which gotten a ton of enemy damage reductions and health nerfs, so that whole instance after the first boss and upwards should be a lot easier for pug players, but also Captain Dalecrate, the first boss, has also been gutted quite a decent bit, health and damage nerfs, so you shouldn't be like a fight that takes an entire eternity for you to overcome. A lot of these changes are going to make it easier for Season 2 players that are trying to get into Mythic Plus content. So if you're someone who didn't play Mythic Plus dungeons, always wanted to find them a little bit challenging or intimidating, this would be a pretty good set of changes to get into dungeons. A lot of the pain points in these instances have been softened more than once now, and there's just another layer of softening, which should make it easier for players to get these dungeons and hopefully have higher completion rates, and hopefully improving the entire experience of Mythic Plus dungeons in Season 2. The next set of changes for a majority is going to concern only PvP players within PvP content, as they're making a bunch of changes when it comes to the PvP ladder to try to create a semblance of balance. One of the first things you'll notice off the bat when it comes to the human racial, actually, the will to survive is now going to have a bit of scaling within PvP. Normally, the will to survive is on a 3-minute cooldown, and whenever you use a PvP trinket in PvP combat, it normally puts will to survive to 90-second DR as a DPS or as a healer. For healers, however, your trinket cooldown is a lot shorter, so they're actually shortening the cooldown reduction DR with will to survive down to 60 seconds for healers, 90 seconds for DPS players. So healers that are playing human are actually seeing a slight buff towards the will to survive racial to break out of CC a lot more regularly. For rest of druids in the Season 2, they're increasing all of your healing by 5%. And they're also buffing your new PvP talent, the Ancient of Lore. Ancient of Lore's damage reduction is going up from 20% up to 30% to make it a little bit better as a defensive option. And also, the mass vulnerability cooldown is being reduced from 8 seconds down to 7 seconds, so you can use AoE healing a lot more regularly. As for Preservation Evokers, we're actually seeing a decent healing buff through the ability of Dream Breath, which is a very basic empowerment ability that can either increase your healing output either as a healing over time effect or as a burst heal, and that heal is being amped up by 20%. There's also a little bit of synergy by buffing Dream Breath is to also buff up the playstyle of Flame Shaper, which uses the engulf ability to consume your Dream Breath to instantly cause it to explode, to have its healing radiate to allies around you, which can add a little bit more burst healing to form a very powerful healing over time effect into an additional burst of healing on your allies. Then we have a class of Hunter with changes for marksmanship and survival. For marksmanship, they're trying to reduce some of their burstiness with tensile bowstring. Instead of reducing the, or I guess increasing the effectiveness of Streamline by 50%, that is getting scaled down to 25%, so you won't have as fast of aim shots that you can pull during your true shot aura. Also, Unerring Vision getting nerfed for PvP as well, increasing critical strike chance by 5% instead of 10%, and increasing crit damage by 10% instead of 20%. As for survival, they're nerfing the capabilities of flanking strike, because they found out that Hunter's survival in particular are finding ways to almost nearly one-shot, if not guarantee one-shot other players when they set up flanking strike correctly. So they're making some adjustments. Flanking strike damage is reduced by 30%, but all other spell and ability damage is buffed up by 4 to try to compensate. The talent of Spearhead now is going to increase the critical strike chance by 15% instead of 30%. Which is one of the abilities you would use to prime a big flanking strike, but also Deadly Duo that increases critical strike damage against players, reduced down to 15%, down from 30%. So less crit chances, less damage to flanking strike, but a 4% damage buff I don't think really makes up for the difference that the nerf to flanking strike is going to make. Then we got a nerf for Fire Mages, specifically if you play the hero spec of Frostfire, which is a pretty powerful combo, especially as of recently. Frostfire's severe temperature talent has been nerfed to be 50% effective within PvP, so instead of increasing the damage of a Frostfire bolt by 10% up to 5 times, up to 50% more damage, that's going to be cut down to 25%. Also, Frostfire Empowerment, which further amplifies that Frostfire bolt damage, is being reduced from PvP modifier of 36% more damage down to 15% more damage, so quite a decent reduction from a single proc ability. The next class is Monk, where both Mistweaver and Windwalker are seeing a reduction towards their Conduit of Celestial Conduit damage, reducing it by 12% for both of these specs, which is a slight reduction, but enough to make it a little bit less deadly, though still very bursty. Then we have the spec of Retribution Paladin, which is generally a pretty good solo option for endgame content within PvP last season, and maybe look it up this season, especially with some of these recent buffs. Blade of Justice is seeing its damage go up by 25%, Final Verdict damage increase by 10%, Judgment damage increase by 20%, and the dot of Expurg dot damage increased by 40%. So basic combat abilities for Retribution has just gone up by a decent bit. Then we have Disciple Priest, and it looks like they're reigning as a dominant healer, at least right now in Season 2. So they're trying to give other healers a little bit more breathing room, but also making adjustments to discs so they're not just playing into only Oracle, by giving them some alternative playstyle and options. But some of the basic healing cooldowns and healing overall is going to have to go down a little. Things like Power Word Shield Absorb is reduced by 10%. Power Word Radiance Healing also reduced by 10%. The PvP talent of Archangel, that's also going to reduce the effectiveness of that Evangelism healing instead of by increasing it by 30%, only increasing it by 15%. Penance damage as well as the healing components are also reduced by 10%, and also Oracle, the Premonition of Solace absorption is also reduced further by 25% within PvP content. However, they do want to give Disc a bit of an alternative by allowing Void Weaver to be something viable. Even though it's a cast-heavy playstyle, they do want to make sure that it doesn't really fall behind and gives Disc Priest a little bit more room to be able to pick between two different hero options. So things like Inner Quietus, effectiveness is now increased by 25%, Void Blast damage increased by 30%, and even Void Infusion Atonement Healing is further increased by 60%. The Disc Priest is not the only spec of priest that's seeing a lot of changes, as Holy Priest is also seeing quite a decent bit, and it looks like they missed the mark for Holy in PvP by quite a bit. You'll see what I mean. Divine Hymn Healing increased by 80%, which means that this ability was severely behind to what they were trying to do, especially as they had a couple of new talents, one of which was try to improve the usability of the ability to Divine Hymn as Holy. Outside of it, Holy compared to Disc doesn't really do as much damage, so certain abilities such as your Holy Fire damage increased by 30%, and even Smite damage is increased by 80%. And if you're increasing abilities by this much, it does tell me that usually that's where they know that they missed the mark on the spec and are trying to find ways to supplement its output. Then we have the spec of Subtlety, where they're looking to nerf some of the max damage output of the spec, but they're looking to improve its consistency. To make it the Subtlety can still exert quite a decent bit of pressure, but when it comes to it setting up some of the biggest bursts possible, there's a lot of little overlapping modifiers that can give them some of the biggest damage out there, and they're trying to soften those a bit. So, certain talents, such as Finality, are seeing a reduction where they'll now increase the finisher damage by 8 and 50% in PvP, previously 15 and 30%. Shadow Blades also been adjusted to duplicate finisher damage at 10% value instead of 15%. Darkest Night, the capstone for Deathstalker, is going to increase the damage of Eviscerate by 10% rather than 19%. And the talent of Symbolic Victory is going to increase the Eviscerate damage by 10% rather than 18%. Capstone of Dance Macabre is going to increase your overall damage by 2% per stack instead of 4%. But Subtlety is being supplemented with additional damage buffs. Backstab and Gloomblade buffed by 20%. Shadow Strike buffed by 20%, which could have some potential value with things like the Rotten. Rupture buffed up by 25%, Eviscerate buffed by 25%, and even Secret Technique buffed by 10%. Lastly, we have the spec of Elemental Shaman, and they're making a number of changes for the playstyle. One of the first things they wanted to do is reduce its reliance on overloads, reducing its damage by 60% within PvP. So elemental overloads, while they can be strong on their own, especially if you play with things like your Ascendants, which gives you more procs, making them overly reliant on cooldowns like this can sometimes reduce some of the overall pressure. And it looks like the overall pressure is going up by a decent bit. Mastery damage is being increased for physical and elemental, but now made 30% more effective within PvP combat. The damage of Lava Burst buffed up by 20%. Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning by 30%, even things like Ice Fury buffed up by 20% and Frost Shock by 20%, and the playstyle of Stormbringer, the main Tempest ability, buffed up by 20% as well, which does make them, I guess they're trying to offer opportunity for them to be more caster heavy, more standstill heavy. There's enough Lava Burst value here that I think it's going to be worth, but they're really, I think, trying to push and make the playstyle Storm Conduit just a little bit better. Lastly, we have the class of Warrior, and last week they ended up nerfing a bunch of your damage for PvP combat specifically, and it looks like this week is no other. One of the combinations that we've seen Warriors do quite a bit is apply Champion Spear to lock an enemy down while being able to output some of the best crits out there. But it looks like Champion's Might Critical Strike damage is being reduced, Where previously it increased your damage by 25% on critical strikes, now reduced down to 15%, so a little bit extra crit damage taken out of the equation. As always though, I want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord, probably the best way to discuss all of the newest changes as soon as they hit 11.1 realms. Also, let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in our next one.